public-private partnerships. We are organizing this at the India Sustainability Launch. As Terry, I am happy to invite all of you. We are organizing this jointly with Invest India as well as the Ministry of Industry and Commerce. So welcome all of you to this fireside chat. We did have, I think, the Minister R.K. Singh just 5 minutes back. He inaugurated the sustainability launch, and we did talk about the decarbonization topic, which we are going to talk now. He did mention about the subject of India enhancing its NDC targets by 2030, and also talked about the net zero opportunities which we have. So I think we are going to touch on these subjects briefly in the next 30 minutes or so, I guess. So my name is Girish Sethi, and I guess I have interacted with you briefly before this. So I'll start just giving a bit of background, I think, for this, that we as a country, I think we all know that we have already given our commitment that we will be reaching net zero by 2070. This was announced by the Honorable Prime Minister at the Glasgow COP. And subsequently, I think now many schemes, many ideas have actually at the government level already started in India, including the latest, which was the green hydrogen mission, which was announced just a few days back, I think 10 days back, which was announced, and which is a huge, huge opportunity for India when we are moving towards a net carbon society. So without further ado, I'll just like to start with this panel discussion. I would request, I think, each one of you to be brief in your remarks and comments, maybe around 3 to 4 minutes each, and then we can pass it on. And if there are other questions from the colleagues later, we can always take them on. So maybe I will just start with Jeremy. I think Mr. Jeremy Oppenheim, who is a senior partner with the Energy Transition Commission and also board member of the Mission Partnership, Mission Possible Partnership. So, sir, I think ETC has been working in this space for quite a long time. I think you have worked globally on this sectors, whether it's energy transition or the industry transition. So, and I know, I think at ETC you have lots of Indian private sector corporates also working very closely with you. So what in your view is something which you would like to say, the role of the Indian corporates? Are they aligned with the whole idea as we move forward in this direction when you're working on these directions at your end, at ETC end?
Well, thank you for inviting me to the panel. I mean, what we have seen in the last few years, and you will have observed it more acutely and directly in India, is just this incredible sea change in mindset and expectation, right? I mean, I remember working, on the journey to net zero and across different economies, including India's economy 10 years ago. And the conversation was all about what's it going to cost. I mean, in all honesty, that was the conversation. And yeah, it was fine for the developed world to do it, but not for the developing world. And I feel like there's a totally different conversation happening today. And that conversation comes from a place of opportunity, and it's not to pretend that there are no transition costs. But it is to recognize that there are technologies coming through, with solar being an obvious example, that are unlocking immense potential for the transformation, not just of the energy system in India, but of the economy as a whole. And that is feeding through into green hydrogen, and that is going to feed through into green steel and into green cement and into a whole set of technologies and industries where India has a chance of being world class. And the companies that we have as members of the Energy Transition Commission, and it's just 3 or 4 Indian companies, but they are the tip of the spear, because it feels like there are lots of both larger Indian companies, right, the household names, if you will, but I'm seeing incredible innovation happening amongst smaller companies and a whole startup world taking place. So it feels to me that this combination of very strong government commitment, right? And let's not forget, this doesn't just happen by itself, but really strong government commitment translated into large-scale investment that is now beginning to, if you will, take off, right, and change the economics, right, of the way in which, in particular, the energy system is beginning to function. And combined with this other extraordinary asset that India has, which is an entrepreneurial, innovative, very strong, if you will, kind of, capacity, right, to develop new ideas and actually commercialize them quickly. That is a great combination, and it is, I hope, going to be a reason why India will go even faster than some of the government numbers?
That's really good to hear. I think that the point which you're mentioning, that India is going to move faster than what many people believe. Good to hear that. Maybe I'll just move to you, Mr. Paul Marriott. I think Mr. Paul Marriott is from SAP, and I know SAP has a huge commitment toward Asia Pacific, Japan, and India in particular. We at TERI are fortunate to have this MOU with you. I would just like to mention that since we are at Davos, and I think I know you have been also associated with this WEF global report, which risks report, which was launched. So from your perspective, how do you really see the vulnerability of India as a country to all the climate actions, to all these things which are happening in the short term as well as in the longer term? I think this WEF report, risk report, did talk about that climate change is going to be a major factor for both in the short term as well as in the long term in the risk ranking which was there. I was going through that.
And builds a little bit on what Jeremy was saying. So look, firstly, thank you for having me. I'm Singapore-based, running the SAP. We call it SAP these days. The region, and you're right, Asia's a really important market for us as a global German company, because unfortunately half of the world's emissions are coming out of Asia, and India's in the top 3, so it's a really significant challenge. And in fact, tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about a paper that we wrote with BCG, which equates that to the potential the negative economic impact. So if you look at India, if we don't solve for this and accelerate it, and severe climate change continues, you could have anything from a 30 to 35% GDP, negative GDP impact. So there's clearly a very significant financial impact, which I think is well understood today, that wasn't previously understood. There is an incredible amount of activity in the startup community. I mean, like India boasts being again in the top 3 countries in the world in terms of startup activity. You know, the growth, the unicorns that come out of the market is really significant. And we've seen a big shift in the focus of those startups to driving sustainable solutions. At SAP, why it's particularly interesting for us is if you look at our customers, so in India or globally, 87% of the world's commerce is flowing through our customers' platforms in SAP's ERP systems, and really sustainability is a resource management problem. So we feel very strongly that if you can currently, unfortunately, run take, make, waste process at scale globally, around 87% of the world's commerce, how do we re-engineer that with that startup community? How do you ignite that green tech in India to really shift the way in which you build a business process for the big, large companies, but also for what is a massive mid-market? And we see significant traction in that. A couple of things that I think are barriers. We talked a little bit before we joined the panel. One is just some of the regulation. You know, if you're shifting from fossil to renewables, there's some significant barriers there that I think need to be worked on. Like, I think India can be the world's platform for green energy, but regulation needs to be accelerated for sure. And obviously continuing to drive both a sustainable and a financial impact around the business case with companies in India, I think is important, just to the mindset and the more financially driven mindset of the large organizations in particular. But big opportunity, and very excited to be here to discuss more with my colleagues.
Thanks, Paul. I think for this positive words, I think you see a big opportunity. I know huge opportunities for India in the startup space, and good to hear that almost 86% figure you mentioned are part of your network there who carry the ideas forward. So I'll now move over to your colleague, I think, Marcus. Marcus is from BASF Venture Capital. I think another big name from this part of the world, but I think you also have huge opportunities in India. And I know BASF has been a global player in the chemical sector, in the specialty chemical sector, as well as, I think, trying to develop solutions, whether it is on the nature-based solutions or on carbon capture and storage. So what is it that you see as BASF Venture Capital in terms of triggering leadership in this area, in India specifically, or maybe in that part of the world?
Yeah, I can only confirm what the previous speakers have said about what attracted us to India. On the one hand, we have a traditional chemical business in India, and with that, BASF, of course, we have ambitious goals, which are more ambitious than government goals in terms of when we want to be net zero, so that's 2050. And of course, we want to take India along our goals for the whole organization. Representing the global corporate venture activities of BASF, I would like to point out what attracted us to India was primarily the talent that we find. So extremely well-educated people, very ambitious entrepreneurs. So we started to look at the ecosystem 4 or 5 years ago, and then decided to come to India to build a team and to start investing as a venture capital investor in the local startup ecosystem, which of course has developed very nicely over the last years. And we have found great startups, impressive entrepreneurs, extremely well-educated and ambitious teams. And we of course will have a focus on those teams that also will help us with both, let's say, big transition topics we are working on with BASF. One is digitalization, 2 is sustainability. And in terms of sustainability, of course, that's today the dominant element in our investment philosophy. And I'm very happy to report that one of our portfolio companies, where we only invested last year, now is here at the World Economic Forum and has been selected one of the top 10 innovators. It's a company called C6 from Bangalore. And what they do is generating the whole value chain, the chemical value chain, starting with red seaweed. So growing the red seaweed, processing it, and building products from that, which has a goal, of course, to replace petrochemical as a feedstock. And they are doing such a good job in this new chemical value chain that they also earned the recognition of the World Economic Forum and are here today with me. Nelson is around, and they will give a speech later on. And so we already see shortly after investing in starting to invest in India that, of course, that apparently we made a very good choice, that we find companies in India that win global recognition.
So thanks, I think, Marcus, for these inputs. I think I'll now like to move to Anthony from chemicals. Of course, is I think one of the, we always call it as the hard to abate sector, or the most hard to abate sector, if one can call it. But I think there are other sectors like steel, cement, aluminium, I think, which Mission Possible Partnership has been working on. And you must have heard that in case of India, I think with the huge investments in infrastructure which are going to happen over the next coming decades, we are going to double, triple our capacities of these legacy sectors like cement and steel. So what do you see in India? What should the large companies be doing in terms of investing in these kind of new sectors when they are going for new green investments? Any thoughts? I know Mission Possible Partnership has been working with all these harder to build, difficult sectors, I think, for quite a few years, I think.
Well, I'm going to talk about something slightly different, but it was very inspired by the work of the Mission Possible Partnership and that work. And I think it's a story of pessimism, or may I say reality check and optimism. I mean, Jeremy and my co-panelists are absolutely right. You know, for many of us working in this space for many years, where we are now is incredibly exciting because the momentum, the level at which these issues around decarbonisation, net zero, etc., are moving is incredibly heartening. And if it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we could relax and think we'd probably get there. But the reality check is that we're not going to get at the speed and scale we need. And what the Mission Possible Partnership did, and I used to be the executive director, but have now handed that over to others who are even more competent and who are driving this forward. One of the most important things it did is it set out these sector transition strategies based on these high ambition net zero roadmaps backed by the high ambition companies in each of those sectors. And it set out where you need to be in 2025, 2030, 2035. So for example, in 2030, if we're to be on track for net zero, we need 100 commercial scale green steel plants in the world. There's 600 in total. And of course, it goes up exponentially as you get to 2035, 2040. We need at least 200 zero emission ships and 6 green corridors. We need 1.5 million zero emissions trucks. We need 400 to 500 sustainable aviation fuel facilities. And of course, we then need to look at what that means regionally and take those global roadmaps down. And it's the same across every other sector of the economy. It's the same for nature and oceans. Where we are now and where we need to be, we are not even close. And whilst we're seeing great momentum, and we will undoubtedly get to a low carbon net zero world, unless we find a way to catalyze this, we're not going to get there on time at the speed and scale required. And so the thing so this work and other work inspired us to the launch today of what we're calling the Gaia call to action, which is giving to amplify Earth action. We've talked about public-private collaboration here, but the CEO of IKEA back in New York referred to philanthropy as the forgotten child of finance. And I think it's also the forgotten child of collaboration, because I think what we are realizing is when you see big changes in society, philanthropy in its various forms always plays a part. And it's most catalytic when it's working alongside government and the private sector. And actually, Rockefeller has a long and proud history of doing this. And if you go right the way back to the inception of the Rockefeller Foundation, it drove many of the most important societal changes by starting this catalytic pace, working with governments and working with the private sector. And as we sort of went through this process, we made the startling discovery, and that of total philanthropy in the world, which depending on how you count it, it's between 800 billion and $1 trillion per year, less than 2% of that goes to climate mitigation. Less than 2%. And those who know, it's probably not sure, but those who don't know, I mean, I've watched so many people's jaws drop. So the point of Gaia is both to sort of get that on the global consciousness and to raise global giving to a level that is commensurate with the climate and nature crisis we face. But if we just did that, yes, it'll have some positive impact, but it's also to create that framework within which it can be catalytic. As John Kerry said at the launch this morning, it's leverage. It's all about leverage. So philanthropy may be small, but as Helen Mountford, the CEO of ClimateWorks, said, it's a small but mighty P. And so to your, bringing this back to your question, and actually, where we have philanthropic support to the Mission Possible Partnership, the 24 million from the Bezos Earth Fund, is focused on accelerating the decarbonisation in 2 clusters. A large part of that work will be creating teams who can accelerate that process of rewiring all of those relationships, because the connections, the supply chains, the relationships between companies up and down those supply chains, across those supply chains, in a decarbonised world that relies on hydrogen, massive scale up of clean power, as opposed to direct fossil fuels, things like ammonia, circular economy, et cetera, are going to be very different. And that rewiring, rebuilding, breaking the existing relationships and renewing those relationships is going to take time. Philanthropy can play a catalytic role in creating teams that can do that. And also play a catalytic role, as we've discovered with other examples, where it is funding in asset management, almost investment banks, green investment bank style platforms who can take 2, 3, or 4 years putting deals together. We're also seeing where it is playing that role that we all expected the multilaterals and the development banks would play of de-risking investment, and de-risking it to actually bring in the public money from multilaterals and governments, and then the private sector. I'll give you one example. It's a small scale, but CSEF in Southeast Asia raised 15 million from 5 or 6 different foundations. They use that to leverage about 170 plus million out of the Asian Development Bank. And then they've shown us numbers that show that for every dollar of philanthropy, they're unlocking 20 times as much from the private sector. In fact, there's another really good example, and I don't know if the number that has been leveraged from GIAP, from the 1.5 billion, you put 500 million in, I don't know if that number is public, how many times, the leverage for the multilateral commitments you've now raised. Is that public? Can I say?
We are public with 9 billion.
Public with 9 billion, which is pretty impressive. And if you think about that 9 billion, the 1.5 billion, now we've been talking and brainstorming about how you can use that to leverage many, many times as much private sector money. So, and this is also regional, because most of that 2% comes from Western philanthropy, yet the biggest growth in philanthropy is in places like India and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. So we're a strategic partner in a new initiative called the Philanthropy Asia Alliance with Temasek Trust out of Singapore, who will launch this next September in a Singapore summit. But my challenge, maybe I'll leave it with this is, could we do something similar in India? Could we engage Indian philanthropy, Indian family offices, to build an initiative that mobilizes philanthropy and new philanthropy, because we don't want to take it away from really good public causes like education and health, etc. But philanthropy is growing, wealth is growing. Can we leverage that to resource the sort of rewiring in industry that we need to see, the sort of de-risking we need to see to catalyze the process that will happen, I think, anyway, because it just makes sense, but to catalyze it at the speed and scale that is required. And so we move from public-private collaboration to public-private philanthropic collaboration and partnerships.
Yeah, that's really nice. I think it's good that you brought in this angle of philanthropy into it, and maybe I'll get Carl to respond to that and maybe add his views on this. If you allow me, I think I can just, because we are on the subject of philanthropy, so maybe if you would just jump in at this stage and then give your views on how, I think the point which you mentioned about how we can get the Indian business houses to really add to this international philanthropy, more US-based philanthropy. I think any thought process on that?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Anthony. And it was great to see the Gaia launch today and to be a part of that. So thank you for involving us. I love the point that you make that philanthropy, while it is small, can be mighty. And the way that it can be mighty is by going in first into a place that, might not be suitable for corporate or even government necessarily support. That's where we want to be. We want to be at the cutting edge. And then we want to have people follow fast after, right? So the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet is a great example, especially for this panel, because some of the first grants that we issued that led to this, it was more than 10 years ago, I believe, that we started working in clean energy and energy access. And it was through a partnership with Tata that we started to put solar mini grids together in India. And that started the ball rolling on something that then at COP26 became the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet with the IKEA Foundation and Bezos Earth Fund. Since then, we've increased the leverage, to your point, by bringing in the public sector, NDB's DFIs, and that's exactly the model that we want to continue to push forward. So our Asia regional office, for instance, recently seeded a grant to a group within the entrepreneurship space. So this is the Global Alliance, so another Global Alliance, for mass entrepreneurship that aims to create 10 million new entrepreneurs, half of whom will be women by the year 2030, that will then generate 30 million new jobs. It's something like this where they can take a seed grant from us, but it can't stop there, right? We need to be able to connect with the other Ps. We need to connect with the corporate partners. We need to connect with the government partners. And through doing that, we can go from the millions of philanthropy to the billions of the 4 Ps all coming together in partnership. So that's absolutely our vision. And to take what Anthony's saying a step further, we'd love to work with philanthropies across the world and in Asia, and then to connect it in with the public and private sector more broadly so that we can really take on these challenges that are well beyond any of us individually, but collectively, we are greater than the challenges.
Yeah, thanks. I think this point which you mentioned about entrepreneurship and how we can, I think this also very clearly links with, I would say, Pankaj, the way your company, I think Pankaj represents a company called Panitech, and which has been working on promoting innovation and clean technology options, specifically in India, I think over the last few years. So I think maybe if you would like to just give your views on how this whole thing can be linked up, whether it is with philanthropy, without philanthropy, or the model which you have been following over the last few years.
Thanks, Girish. What I like to do is bring a little bit of a entrepreneurial and a technology perspective to this discussion. I think we all agree that in India, in the next years, renewable energy is going to be very, very important. In our company, we always say that the 80% of the new factories in India are yet to be built. 80% of the infrastructure is yet to be built, which brings in a lot of challenges. In India, we believe, for us, it's an existential. Renewable energy is existential issue. We cannot. For us, we have no choice, right? And it's very clear that we have renewable energy, like solar energy, wind energy has become mainstream now, and it has bringing renewable energy has several technological dimensions. One of the things that we are looking at is how do we integrate renewable energy? Because what's happening today is with distributed energy, renewable energy, the whole paradigm of how you generate energy, how you bring it to the energy, how is energy being used is changing. And that requires the new way of thinking. The older perspective was a big power plant and a consumer. Now everything is networked. The whole grid, everything is getting digitalized. So one aspect which I'd like to really focus on how digitalization is happening and how India can leapfrog to the new way of distribution of energy. We are working very closely with TERI on that. We're working on a UN-funded program on piloting a digital, bringing digital transparency to the grid at the distribution level. And the reason for that is not only, of course, integration of the intermittent sources of renewable energy and EVs, et cetera, but also make sure that as the grid digitalizes, the digital divide that one might see, we don't leave people behind. That's another very, very important aspect that we're looking at. So I think technology will play a very, very important role, but integrating that technology, bringing all the stakeholders together is also going to play a very important role. That's why institutions like Rockefeller Foundation and other institutions can play a very, very important role. And of course, regulation also has to keep up with this. So that's our view, and that's why we see is going to be very, very important.
So yeah, thanks. I think Pankaj for bringing in this angle of digitalization. I think, and that's extremely important, especially when we are looking at this whole subject of decarbonization, and when we are talking about more and more electrification of even the heat to electricity. We are talking about more and more electric cars coming in, electric vehicles coming in. They're going to charge in the evening. What is going to happen to the grids at the local level? So I think these are the things which will be extremely important when we move in that direction. Let me now move to Dr. Asa Persson. I think she's from the Stockholm Environment Institute and based out of Stockholm in Sweden. And I think everybody knows about SCI. And I would just leave it to you to say from your side, how do you see this whole initiative in India on industry decarbonization moving forward on net zero space? I think you, just for everybody, I think Stockholm Environment Institute is the secretariat for this leadership group on industry transition, and which was launched, I think in 2019 at the UN Climate Summit in New York. And then India and Sweden are the co-leads in that. So I think any thoughts, what you see in terms of the process moving forward from your perspective?
Thank you so much for inviting us. So yes, this leadership group for industry transition is something we're extremely proud of being, part of and supporting. And I think it steps into this space created by the Mission Possible partnerships. To date, we have around 20 country members and 20 corporations. So it's a good balance, which I think makes it also not only kind of effective, but also very legitimate. And hopefully it has contributed to putting industry transition firmly on the agenda, showing that there is business opportunity in green steel, green cement, etc. And the theory of change, I think, that Lead It works with is that indeed there are many forms of public-private partnerships beyond the traditional regulations, subsidies, or government providing the infrastructure. One being during the sectoral road mapping that you introduced. We're very proud to have done 2 roadmaps now with India recently, also South Africa, bringing all the actors together. And I think this is essential not just for planning the actual transition technically and in policy terms, but actually a very positive by-effect is the credibility it creates on NDC implementation more broadly. And that's what we hear now from the UN level, that we need to step up in terms of credibility and accountability. Technological collaboration, of course, and if I can just step out of this sort of heavy industry bubble a little while looking more broadly at sustainability, we think, and this is something we put forward to the Stockholm Plus 50 meeting earlier this year, when we look back, 50 years of sustainable development governance. We've talked a lot about technology transfer, and this is what we often hear from developing countries, but it's a very outdated mode, means of implementation. How can we think new around co-development of technology And I think there's really a role for of course, the private sector and philanthropy to help innovate in that space. Mobilizing finance, de-risking, of course, supporting market creation. There's been a big demand from the members of LEADIT to look into green public procurement, for example, and developing common standards and definitions of these products that are now hopefully coming on the market soon. And the last aspect, I think, to also try and provide the data necessary for this, global transition and reducing the information asymmetry to track, all these initiatives and share that information. So the LEADIT has 3 trackers on industry transition roadmaps, on green steel projects, on green cement projects. But to wrap up, what are the plans for the coming year? Of course, we're very excited about the G20 presidency of India and look forward to working with you. Really, we want to do more of the road mapping with more countries. That's the essential starting point. But also to try contributing to mobilizing actors in really coming together on these first of its kind projects. So real commercial implementation of green steel, green cement, some of these types of technologies in an emerging or developing economy. Coming from Sweden, I can say that the sort of green steel plants up in the north have had such a big ripple effect on the climate transition at large. So having those demonstration facilities is so important. It feels a bit like a modest ambition now, hearing about the speed at which we need to scale this that you laid out, Anthony. But I think if we could contribute to that, it would be very worthwhile. Final point is the skills gap and also the gender gap. Do we have the workforce ready, both in terms of actual skills and sort of quality of knowledge, but also volume of people entering these new industries? So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think when I'm is really looking forward to a full-scale commercial production from this green steel project in Sweden, I think, moving ahead. And I think there has been news that they are accelerating the production process. So everybody is really looking forward to this green steel project, which will perhaps one of the largest green steel projects in Sweden. And thanks a lot, I think, for putting forward this whole theme of green steel and green products to a different scale altogether. I'll now finally move to Prem Bhatasati. He's the managing partner for Pontac Venture Capital. I think you work on the India-UK side, and everybody's what we are talking about: green steel, green cement, batteries, innovation, technology. I think without finance, without money, nothing can move forward. So over to you to say a few words how you are moving forward in terms of helping India move the needle to decarbonization.
Right. First of all, thanks for inviting us. As I said, we happen to work in the third and the fourth innovation index countries in the world. So that's pretty much a very prestigious moment for us. So we ventured into India back end of last year or early last year. And we talked a lot about entrepreneurship and startup ecosystem. What we have witnessed in the last 8 years is the transition of India in terms of moving to kind of creating innovative and globally leading edge technologies in various aspects. I would like to kind of give a few figures. So Indian startup ecosystem is well over 75,000 startups. Last year alone, we saw 6,000 startups across countries, across the country. And we have made investments in 22 states across the country. From 6,000, we filtered down to a bit over 50. But most importantly, what we witnessed was almost 30 to 35% of these companies were in clean tech in various aspects, be it in terms of energy or be it in terms of decarbonization and what have you. I would like to specifically talk about 2 projects that we have supported and which eventually will come to Rockefeller Foundation, other corporates for support. One is in terms of the decarbonization on the tuk-tuks or the autos. So India has got close to about 7.5 million tuk-tuks, including both cargo and 3-wheelers and 4-wheelers. So this company has actually built a electric motor which can kind of be retrofitted in under 2 hours, which essentially means for each retrofit, it's about 24 trees planted. So what we want to do is we want to go on a massive scale, which the company is also geared up for, is let's assume hypothetically we're able to transform 200 tuk-tuks in 1,000 days or 2,000 days. That's equivalent to close to 500 million of carbon emissions. So that's quite substantial. But for that 200,000, what we require is roughly about $400 million. Right, but then that's where the PPP model comes into play. And we spoke about public-private philanthropic partnership. I would like to add a fifth P as well, which I'll come on later. And the second one is something that I tell my kids is, what am I leaving you with? Am I leaving you with a better world, or am I creating a much more toxic world, which is the high end, much more toxic than plastic that I'm leaving you, which is batteries? So that's something that I'm personally scared of every single day, because I'm living with my kids. So to that end, we actually invested in a biodegradable battery company, which is getting waste out of crop residue of high protein rice and wheat, and taking them and converting them into some sort of electrolyte, and then making them as a battery. And that is being proven as we speak, and that is equivalent to about 90% biodegradable battery. If you also take the enclosures, which is plastic, you can't get away with that. So these are two different aspects, as an example, that we are investing into, or invested into, and where we see we can add value to much more decarbonization, or much more in terms of energy offsetting and so on and so forth. So coming to the point, and what we would like to see more of, we spoke about public-private partnership, philanthropy. For example, if you take the tuk-tuk project as an example, we need $400 million to take $500 million out, and there is interest everywhere. If you think about the global economic, global scene of finance, we traditionally go into governments, DFIs, banks, but banks predominantly is focused on retail and commercial banks. But majority of the wealth is actually in the wealth management space. Right, you're talking about trillions of dollars of wealth management, and increasingly every single new generation high net worth individuals are moving and taking to climate change, and there is an allocation. At the same time, what we are finding increasingly is the wealth managers and banks in the private wealth do not necessarily seem to have products to be able to cater to this particular high net worth individuals, high net worth family offices, which we touched upon. So if only there was an opportunity where you have a government guarantee at the back of such projects, you bundle them as a beating inflation, not the current inflation, obviously, beating inflation, and then you give it something like a bond or whatever to these as products carved out for these high net worth individuals. I'm sure there'll be much more clean finance coming into the main foray, coupled with the likes of Rockefeller Foundation and others, and the world should be able to see much more better opportunities for growth. So on that note, I think there is a fifth P, which is public-private philanthropy, private bank partnership, coming from another P, which is Prem. Thank you very much.
So thanks. I think this is very nice to bring in the fifth P here, the private banks here. So we have moved, I would say, from a public-private partnership initiative to public-private philanthropic private banking partnership. So 5 Ps, I think. So thanks, everybody. I think, is there any last word from any one of you on this? How do you see India moving faster on this net zero pathway, I think, which has been the theme of this discussion? Anybody wants to say a few words? Maybe we want to say, Anthony.
I mean, I think for any country to really accelerate in this space, and I'm going to pick up on your point, is the companies need to understand what's expected of them. And so one of the things that has sort of inspired us with what we are doing is that there's lots of companies have made these commitments to net zero. But I don't know if you've heard of this new theme that's coming out, climate hushing. And one of the reasons for this is now companies going a little bit quiet. They've been making a lot of noise about these net zero commitments and nature commitments, now going a little bit quiet. And the reason they're going quiet is because they're now looking at the reality of, I've made this commitment, so I'm a steel company, or I'm a cement company, or I'm a shipping company, or I'm an airline. What does a really coherent strategy and pathway look like for me as a company, that when the shareholders kick the tires on that, it's credible, it stands up? And I have a lot of sympathy for them, because unless you can't do that in a vacuum. And that's why this work that Mission Possible has been doing, that Lead It have been doing on the sectoral pathways, and now dropping this down to a level that is regionalized and even at a country level, so that governments can then set that out in their NDCs, is so critically important. Because once you've done that, you also give your companies a competitive advantage, because then they can look at the framework the government has set out and start to develop their strategies and pathways and get on with it. And that is critically important. But you have to do that across the economy, because you need the energy sector, you need industry, you need retail. Everyone's got to be involved, because someone's scopes 1 and 2 is someone else's scopes 3, and vice versa. And I'll finish. What's this got to do with philanthropy? Well, those global pathways that we developed cost about $20 to $30 million. Half of that came from Bezos Earth Fund, Breakthrough Energy, Mountain Philanthropy, and one other, which is terrible that I've forgotten, Bloomberg, and a lot of pro bono from Systemic and McKinsey, which I would count as a form of philanthropy, because government companies are not going to get together to do it. It's quite difficult, I think, for governments to issue the sort of money to develop those sorts of global roadmaps that then are necessary nationally. So that's where philanthropy plays a really important part in that sort of rewiring and those frameworks. So I think that would be, if India as a country, as a government, can now take that next step, building on what's been funded by philanthropy and develop that at a national level, that could make a huge difference in unlocking the decarbonisation we're looking for in heavy industry, steel, cement, etc.
Yeah.
I think we're all going to have a
Yeah,
quick
please
comment.
go ahead.
So, look, I guess I see this at quite a practical level. So, one of the framework initiatives is digital transformation. We are working with thousands of customers in India on digital transformation. Those programs that are heavily invested in are not connected to the strategic sustainability goals, right? They're struggling to make the connection between digital transformation of the business for financial gain, and now how do I do that sustainably? And I think things like SBTI, in terms of science-based targets, to create a framework for them plotting that roadmap of how digital transformation can help you get there is a great initiative I'm seeing more and more Indian customers embark on. But even more practically, most Indian customers don't know what they don't know. So just basic ESG transparency, and there is a proliferation of really mature technology now that lets any organization, big or small, have at least a handle on some accurate ESG transparency of where their organization is currently at. You can start that tomorrow. So I think that's a very practical next step if companies are not doing that.
So in my view, both India and the rest of the world are undergoing a major transition. India on its own in terms of domestic consumption, and the world is placing its demands on India. Now, it's all good that you have India moving towards decarbonization and all its goals and more energy, but that is going to be tremendously pressurized by the global demand that is coming in as well. So there needs to be a careful balance between how do you balance the current demand, which is on India, by India and by the world, to 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, where due to macroeconomic changes, all the demand of the globe is coming into India, and how is it going to be offset? That's something to be carefully considered and planned.
Yes, I think that's the key point. I think India is a huge economy. We have a huge domestic demand, and today we are talking about recession around the world in many parts of the world, but India as a country is still growing at 7 to 8%, 6%. I think these are the numbers which we have been hearing from various international teams. So with these words, I think I would just like to stop. You want to ask a question, maybe the last one, and then I think we are already
The first and the last.
I'm not sure. I think everybody has.
We did manage to get all the CDMOs. I think this is one of the most powerful panels that I have at least seen in Davos so far now. My question to Adhikalo, Anthony, US. We run a group of companies called under the MRM Group umbrella. We have a cement plant. We've got wind and solar hybrid parks, and then we run True All Bioenergy is our main company where we produce about 2 million liters of ethanol, the first generation ethanol, and we are in touch with Shell India. And of course, so my point is going green. I mean, the transition has a lot of profitable angle to this. Now the challenge is India has opened up a lot of policy benefits for companies like us to scale up, right? So there is always, like how Prem just brought to the fore, right? You only have 2 or 3 P's. That is, the money is, I mean, it's not split across. So the idea of, motivating such small scale companies to, actually bring in or scale up, right? Because there is, it's not just philanthropy, there's a lot of profitability there. So I think there is a gap between the demand and supply. So I think, how do you think, I mean, why do you think is there, or how we can solve that?
Would you go first? I could try. I mean, there's a lot of issues in there, but maybe just pick the gap between demand and supply. So another initiative which the World Economic Forum launched last year is the First Movers Coalition. And this was basically designed, and we launched it in partnership with the US State Department and Secretary John Kerry's team. And the thinking behind that was sort of inspired by the advanced purchase commitments that were used during the pandemic to accelerate the production of vaccines. And it was like, okay, if we can we get companies to create a critical mass of advanced purchase commitments for green steel, for green cement, for green freight services, for green aviation, etc., from 2030 onwards. So there's lots of good green demand initiatives out there, but they're sort of they're for incremental decreases in carbon intensity, whereas FMC was commitments for green steel that's truly low carbon, that the truly low carbon technologies where you actually have to build the green steel plants, but you don't know, if you're a steel company, you don't know whether to build the green steel plant because you're not sure if there'll be buyers. So if we can provide the buyers and they know there will be buyers, then the supply will come. It's that build it and they will come, but it's the reverse almost. Get the customers and then you'll build it. And actually FMC is going to it's got some funding from the US government, a grant from the US government, but it also is relying on philanthropy again. So many of these initiatives that get things moving, catalyze the start of things, are philanthropically funded. But you're right, there's profitability in it, because if there's not enough philanthropy in the world to achieve what we need to do. I mean, there's different estimates. There's an estimates between 3 and 4.5 trillion a year between now and 2050 to get where we need to. There's only $1 trillion a year in philanthropy. So it has to be, that small amount has to be catalytic.
Marcus?
Yeah, if I may add one other element or new perspective here is one element that costs nothing is consumer preferences. If consumer preferences are changing, then of course that will change the whole economy. So it's difficult to think from my perspective that governments will impose, let's say, a certain behavior that is climate mitigating. But in the end, it must come from consumers. We see that in Western Europe, that people are preferring sustainable packaging over traditional packaging. We see that car manufacturers will produce cars where they say when it comes from the conveyor belt, this car is carbon neutral, and there's customer demand for. They say, yes, I want to buy a carbon neutral car that, by the way, also is fully recyclable in its parts. So, and I think that's maybe an appeal also to the Indian middle class, and it's a growing and very important economy, that if consumers are conscious about the products they prefer and they buy, this will trigger a much bigger change than another billion coming from some, let's say, charity organization for climate purpose. So that's maybe one element I would.
Yeah, I think we should be just 2 big 1 minute, and then we should close, I think.
Just one, technologically, one of the things we've seen, which is interesting, we see this in the automotive industry more out of Germany, is the concept of these data exchanges. It's essentially just the ecosystem of suppliers in a common industry exchange. Now, this gives you tremendous business efficiency. It gives you massive automation of your ecosystem at scale, alternative sources of supply, redundancy. So these types of technological business networks and exchanges not only give you financial efficiency, they instrument all of your scope 3 emissions as well. So it's how do you take technology to solve for both at the same time? So we have something called Cartina X in the automotive industry. It does exactly this. We're looking to do something in mining. Maybe with Terry, we look at what sort of business network exchanges could we create that have an India market context that would give us that same financial and sustainable outcome? So food
Maybe
for
I'll
thought.
tell Pankaj to say the last thing because he's an innovative person, so he can.
This must just small comment. I think that the roles of philanthropy, etc., is more as a catalyst. I think India is such a big market that the scale sort of it has to be business driven. And I take example of solar energy. 5-7 years ago, it was 30 cents a unit, and today it's the cheapest form of energy. Okay, there are the challenges of storage, etc., but today it is the cheapest form of energy. So I really think that innovation has to be catalyzed using private philanthropy or whatever it may be, but ultimately it's the businesses which have to take it up and scale it up, and that is what is going to, I think, and I see as an opportunity actually.
Thanks, I think, Pankaj. So I think to me, I think this is a very important point. I think the consumer demand from India and how to really end this session, I think demand from 1 billion plus people, I think that's going to drive the prices down, and we'll see India decarbonizing pretty fast, I think, very, very fast, I would say. Thanks all of you, I think, for joining, and thanks. Thank you.
Yes.